Greetings, everyone. But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near. That's a quote from a poem by English poet and politician Andrew Marvell, from his poem To His Coy Mistress. Marvell lived in the 1600s. So it's from quite a long time ago, and that line from the poem appears in the 1932 film A Farewell to Arms. So that's the film we're going to be talking about today. It stars Gary Cooper as Frederick, who's an American working in Italy, is basically an ambulance driver. So this film is based on a novel, autobiographical novel by Ernest Hemingway. So A Farewell to Arms, the 1932 film, really falls into the romance category, war film category, and like most all war films, the drama category as well. So let's look at that quote one more time. But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near. So I think that's one of the big themes of this film, A Farewell to Arms, is time, and how the characters, they're at a time of war, intense war. It's set during World War I, so time is precious. In the film there's bombings and fighting going on, so one doesn't necessarily know how long you might have to live. So that's why time, I think, is a big theme of the film as well. Helen Hayes co-stars as Catherine, Frederick's love interest in the film. She is basically like a British Red Cross nurse working there. So I know a lot about movies and older movies like this one, but to be totally honest with you, I had never really heard of Helen Hayes before. So that's one of the joys about watching a variety of films and discovering films you hadn't seen before. Aside from seeing new stories and characters, you're also introduced to different actors and actresses. And in this case, I had not knowingly seen any work previously of Helen Hayes. So this film is directed by Frank Borzage, and what was interesting about Frank Borzage is several years earlier he won the very first Academy Award for Best Directing for his film Seventh Heaven. So in particular, A Farewell to Arms won for Best Cinematography and Sound Recording. It did not win for Best Picture. So one of the co-stars is Captain Rinaldi, who's played by Adolphe Menjou. And what's really great about that character is he adds a little balance, a little levity to a pretty serious film. Captain Rinaldi is a very interesting character, and a character who's very important in this film because prior to the romance developing between Catherine and Frederick, Captain Rinaldi, he really wants to he really wants to start a relationship and try to court Catherine and everything. So there's an interesting dynamic there, and Rinaldi is a very kind of boisterous character in some ways, because he kind of wants to go out and almost drink a lot and party and enjoy life, whereas once Frederick develops this love interest with Catherine, he gets a lot more serious and everything. But Rinaldi is actually very consequential, because later in the film, when Catherine and Frederick are apart and writing letters to one another, Rinaldi has the power to make sure those letters that are being sent out don't get sent, and they get returned to sender and everything. So yeah, this film, 1932, that's going really far back, and basically sound movies were only introduced in the late in 1927, so sound movies had not been around very long at all. So going back to the time theme, when it's kind of a whirlwind romance, them meeting, and Gary Cooper's character and Helen Hayes' character. So going back to the time, Frederick mentions that if they had the time, he would have courted her more properly, by taking time and sending her flowers and that sort of thing. But in a time and setting of active war, that wasn't possible. I think they seemed like the characters had to act on, from their hearts a little bit more, act on instinct, and maybe not use their minds as much. So yeah, that's very interesting and everything, because Rinaldi originally wants Frederick to like this other secondary character, Helen Ferguson. She's another one of the nurses who works with Catherine. So, Helen Ferguson is played by Mary Phillips, and she's really not as friendly to Frederick, certainly. She thinks Frederick is just out to, kind of just be just out to have a quick relationship with Catherine and stuff, and she's trying to be a good friend to make her aware of that and everything. And so yeah, the film, really a lot starts to happen, and at one point, I'm not giving too much away here, but Frederick gets injured, okay, and so there is an interesting kind of how it's filmed. He basically goes into a hospital because he needs time to recover and everything, and that's going to bring us to today's vocab words. So there's a scene where he first gets into the hospital, and we're seeing things from his point of view, like he's laying in the bed, and the certain nurses come in and everything. So that initial sequence is very interesting. So the camera is being shot like it's from his eyes. So subjective camera is a camera that views the scene from the visual or emotional point of view of a participant in the action. So in this case, the subjective camera is really from his visual point of view more so. That's also known as a subjective point of view. in the cinematic sense, as opposed to, you know, the literary sense. So this is a subjective point of view in the cinematic sense in that scene in the hospital with Frederick. So that's very interesting and everything. And so yeah, and in that scene when Frederick is still in the hospital, what's very interesting, there's a scene with a priest who comes in, and the priest is played by Jack LaRue. And what's really interesting with that is Jack LaRue, throughout a lot of his career, played really tough guy characters. You know, tough guys, maybe mobsters, even criminal characters. So it's very interesting that Jack LaRue was cast as a priest and everything. So there's this great scene with Catherine and Frederick, and the priest is there as well, and the couple there, they mention children and everything, and you know, the father, as he's referred to in the film, he seems a little agitated or uncomfortable when they bring up children, and that's really interesting. But I think the reason is such because you know, they're not at all married yet. You know, they were really, their relationship is actually pretty new, Catherine and Frederick. So he's, you know, kind of gently taken aback by that thought of them having children, perhaps because they're not married, and, you know, back then, you know, some of the societal norms were a lot more formal and strict than they are today. So Jack LaRue's character basically performs like a kind of spur-of-the-moment marriage ceremony where at least he's blessing them kind of unofficially in the sacrament of marriage. So that's a really great scene, a lot of depth there. And so yeah, I mean, just kind of going back to that quote, "But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near." That's such a beautiful quote, and as I mentioned earlier, that quote is said by Frederick when he and you know, he's with Catherine later on and stuff, and it just shows really, you know, like time is chasing them, and you know, basically one doesn't know when time might catch up with them. So and there's a different film sequence later on which really, it reminded me of a silent film. It's basically a bunch of war sequences, a lot of explosions and bombings and everything, and as we said, silent films were you know, were the mainstay in the film industry just years prior. And so when I saw that sequence of a very heavy war sequence, very chaotic sequence, and just kind of an orchestral music backdrop to these war scenes, it really reminded me of a silent film in that sense. So so yeah, I mean, this film is really a quality film, and especially if you hadn't seen any movies from the early 30s, A Farewell to Arms, there's just a lot of emotion, a lot of raw emotion, and yeah, I don't want to, you know, give too much of the plot away, but back towards the very beginning of the film, when Catherine is first introduced, there's a scene where basically one of her fellow nurses, Molly, is kind of admonished for apparently getting pregnant, and so basically Catherine helps this Molly character pack, because if she's pregnant she has to go home. So that's kind of just telling Catherine's character a little bit, and there's kind of also a little foreshadowing in that instance as well. So A Farewell to Arms was actually remade in 1957, starring Rock Hudson, and but I think I have not seen the 1957 version, but from what I read about these films, it seems like the 1932 version, which I've been talking about, is much higher regarded than the 1957 one, but certainly it's always good to compare and contrast remakes as well, so I do plan to see the 1957 one eventually as well. But as for the 1932 one, yeah, I think we've covered most topics here. Once again, there's some older phrases or language that's used, different words, which I always like. Someone's referred to as a good egg. That's kind of like a phrase, just a good egg is someone who's likable or friendly. So yeah, I mean, this is basically a movie, with a lot happening in a very chaotic time in World War I. Also, the Scala is mentioned. A man just kind of mentions making his opera debut there, and La Scala is a famous, opera place in Italy, which is where this film mostly takes place. For the most part, don't want to give away, but at the end, the film does move the setting a little bit. So yeah, I really thought these were strong acting performances, certainly. Gary Cooper did a great job. His character, Frederick, was not the most likable character. I think that's an interesting point to bring up, especially earlier in the film. Frederick seemed very pushy, very pushy, and with Catherine most specifically, and Frederick was also a little hard-headed, I would say, quite a bit hard-headed, and but yeah, the acting performances were really on point, and this was very much a romance film, a drama film, a war film, and but yeah, I mean, probably the characters whose performance I enjoyed the most, once again, was Adolphe Menjou as Captain Rinaldi. And the captain, he was an officer, but he's also like a doctor. So when Frederick gets injured at a certain point, I mentioned him going into a hospital, Rinaldi actually does help him a little bit get properly bandaged up, and kind of just make sure his old buddy is okay and everything and stuff. But again, Rinaldi is a little, he comes off as friendly and jovial, but he does have some kind of ulterior motives and stuff, with him initially wanting Catherine, and Rinaldi wanting Frederick to court Helen Ferguson, and so Rinaldi again does play a big part, and certainly makes me want to look up other movies with Adolphe Menjou, because I thought he was just really good in this film. I really enjoyed his performance specifically, really the most. I enjoyed Adolphe Menjou's performance as Captain Rinaldi. I thought he brought a lot to this film. Yeah, I think that covers really all of our topics here that I can see. So let's get to the rating here. Am I going to watch it again or say once is enough for the 1932 film A Farewell to Arms? A little bit on the border with this one as well. This is kind of a tough call, as you can hear me talking about the film. But ultimately, I'm going to have to say for the 1932 romance war film drama, A Farewell to Arms, that once is enough. It's a good movie, I would say. Certainly worth watching. I would once, undoubtedly. It's a movie that you really needed to focus in to this film to really see what was going on, to understand, to know the characters, because the characters are kind of, I felt like the characters were developed fairly slowly. So you really needed to stay focused in this film to see where it was going, what the characters' tendencies were, how they might react to certain situations. And but ultimately for the 1932 film A Farewell to Arms, I'm going to have to say once is enough. It was close between possibly being watch it again, but ultimately I'm going to have to say once is enough. So yeah, I think that covers everything for this film. Once again, feel free to comment any suggestions, opinions, or anything. Feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for watching. A Farewell to Arms, 1932. I'm going to have to say once is enough. Until next time.